At this time, I will reconvene in open session this meeting of the Arlington Independent School District Board of Trustees on November 17th, 2022, beginning at 6:46 p.m. Members of the public may access this meeting via the AISD website at www.aisd.net. One or more trustee may participate in this meeting via video conference call. A quorum of the Board of Trustees will be physically present at the Administration Building. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our board meetings are open to the public, and we welcome everyone, and thank you for participating in this public education. While our meetings are open to the public, this is a meeting, and we do have business to conduct. Disruptions will not be permitted. Anyone who disrupts the meeting or speaks when others are speaking may be asked to leave or may be escorted out by the security attending the meeting. We welcome civic input, but we insist that we remain respectful and civil. Thank you for your cooperation tonight. We will start our meeting with the traditional opening ceremony. Please join Dr. Reich in leading us in the pledges.
Please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And to the Texas flag, honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one indivisible.
Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, we'd ask that you please silence all cell phones and electronic devices to avoid disruptions to those around you. And now, please join us in a moment of silence. Thank you. You'll notice tonight that I am not President Fowler, and Mrs. McMurrow is not with us as well. They are out for important family functions. In the absence of having a secretary, it's customary to designate a temporary secretary, and to that end, Mr. Wilbanks has graciously agreed to serve as tonight's secretary. We have no program or presentation for tonight's board meeting. We also have no public hearing, and so now we will move on to appointments. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And tonight, I'd like to recommend that the board ratify the appointment of the individual discussed in closed session for P-TECH Assistant Principal at Sam Houston High School.
Move that we accept the administration's appointments.
I have a motion from Mr. Hibbs and a second from Mr. Wilbanks. At this time, please vote. The motion carries unanimously, 5 votes in favor, none against. Go ahead, Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And tonight, I'd like to introduce the new P-TECH Assistant Principal for Sam Houston High School, Ms. Christy Sullivan. Let's give her a round of applause. And Christy attended University of Texas at Arlington for Bachelor of Science in Biology. You can remain standing, yeah. And University of North Texas in Denton for Master of Education in Secondary Education. Most recently, Christy was our assistant principal at Sam Houston High School, has been a student support interventionist at Sam Houston, and a biology teacher at Sam Houston. But she's also taught 5th grade ELAR, 3rd grade teachers, has been an Aspire mentor in Birdville ISD, an RTI specialist in Eagle Mountain, Saginaw, and then a smaller learning communities grant coordinator in Birdville as well. Christy, congratulations and welcome to the P-TECH Assistant Principal position.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cavazos. And now we come to our open forum for agenda items. As stated on the posted agenda, members of the public who desire to address the board regarding an item on the agenda are requested to register at www.aisd.net/board-meeting-speaker-request no later than 3 p.m. on the day of the board meeting. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board regarding agenda items?
No, sir, not regarding agenda items, only non-agenda.
Thank you, Mrs. Benjamin. If that is the case, then we'll move on to our action agenda item. Tonight we have action agenda A, Item A, consider approval of the annual financial audit report for fiscal year ending June 20th, 2022. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And tonight we bring this for your consideration, the financial audit report. This is an important audit report every year. And I want to start by thanking our staff and our auditors as well, our external auditors, but our staff, the finance division in particular, for all the work in assembling the things that are needed for this audit report. So at this time, I'll ask our financial auditors to make a brief presentation about this year's
Yes.
audit. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cavazos, Vice President Chapa, and members of the board. Earlier this month, we met with the audit committee to go over the results of the financial statement and single audit. So we'll, as Dr. Cavazos said, we'll be brief in our report. The purpose of the financial statement is to issue an opinion, and we are issuing an opinion that the financial statements are free of material misstatement and that they're fairly presented in all material respects. Even though this is not an assessment of the district's economic well-being, if there were a concern, we would bring that to your attention. We started the audit process with the risk assessment and planning in the spring. We identified the key controls in the spring into the summer, tested those controls, not just over financial reporting, but also over compliance. Once the district closed its books, we performed our substantive testing, corroborating, confirming, and vouching, all to issue an opinion and our reports over these financial statements. There's three types of opinions that any entity can receive, and the best one is the unmodified or clean opinion. The other two are not sought after, but Arlington ISD has earned a clean report or an unmodified or clean opinion. I will tell you that you earn this. You've been earning this type of opinion every year, but it should not be taken for granted just because it does take a lot of work to get here on behalf of your staff. So kudos to your staff and thank you to them for helping us get all the documentation and their commitment to excellence as well to get the numbers right, no matter how small or big the adjustments that they needed to make throughout the year. And so we thank them for their efforts. Having to juggle the audit on top of their normal duties is quite the task. We do have to add an additional layer of auditing standards called government auditing standards because you do spend more than $750,000 in federal funds. We don't have any financial statement internal control weaknesses or significant deficiencies, nor any non-compliance. And the non-compliance could be with state procurement or Public Funds Investment Act. Your major federal programs this year were Title I Part A with $17 million, Title III Part A at $2 million, and then ESSER 2 and 3 totaling $68 million. Total federal programs were $142.5 million, so it's a significant jump from the prior years. We are required to test those controls over each of those three federal programs I just listed, and we don't have any findings to report or any non-compliance to report either. On the financial statement, this shows the total net worth of Arlington ISD. It shows all of the assets owned and all of the liabilities and debt owed by the district. For a total of $159.4 million in net position. The highlights on the asset side, cash and investments totaled $898 million, bonds payable and premiums totaled $1.3 billion, and that increased by $124 million. The net pension liability decreased by a whopping $97 million, and then your net OPEB liability increased by $5 million. If you're wondering why did it decrease by so much, the projected investment earnings that were included in the measurement year that ran from September 1st, 2020 through August 31st, 2021 were very favorable, and that brought down that net pension liability. Now, into the measurement year that ends August 31st, 22, probably won't see that, knowing what we know about the investment activity this year. So we may see a swing in the other direction in fiscal year 23. Your general fund revenues totaled $608.5 million, with property taxes making up 58% of your total revenues, or 352.9. The second largest portion of the pie is at 28% for state aid, and then you have TRS on behalf, $30.5 million, which does not represent cash revenue. It is simply it's offset by expenditures, but it is TRS's statement that they have contributed $30.5 million on behalf of Arlington ISD's employees. You also have additional federal revenue in the school health and related services at $17.3 million. And your other federal revenue at $33.3 million is a jump from previous years. That includes prior year expenditures that you were reimbursed for in fiscal year 22 for ESSER 1, 2, and 3, primarily 2 and 3. And that was allowable to do that, and that's why the general fund revenue increased. You were reimbursing yourself for those pre-award costs and also indirect cost. General fund expenditures totaled $558.8 million, with instruction totaling 62, or making up 62% of your expenditures, or $346.5 million. The second largest is your plant maintenance and operations at 10%, or 56.9%. And then instructional and school leadership at $46.1 million. If you go down to the red slice of the pie, you'll see that general administration at $13.9 million, or 3%, is still well below the 8% that TEA uses to evaluate districts' administrative cost, and so you're still well below that percentage. When we look at your budget to actual activity for the general fund, you'll see that your actual revenue exceeded the budgeted amounts by $21.7 million, and your expenditures were less than budgeted by $558.8 million. Overall, you increased fund balance by $52.1 million, and again, the main reason for that is that you had about $33 million from prior years that you were reimbursed for TEA. So that's a unique situation for fiscal year 22. Overall, you ended the year with your fund balance of $296.6 million, with committed fund balance at $11 million. You have non-spendable as well, not a very significant amount, at $2.8 for prepaids and inventory, and assigned and unassigned fund balance at $282.8 million. We aggregated those because those are the two fund balance components that TEA uses to evaluate districts for first rating purposes. When we look at all the general fund components, you'll see that your fund balance is trending in the right direction. This year you set aside, or you committed, the board did, $11 million for future projects, including, I believe, the pre-K program is a large portion of that. The assigned and unassigned fund balance in the last 5 years has decreased some, but just the assigned and unassigned. But overall, total fund balance is going in the right direction. If we look at general fund unassigned assigned fund balance as a percentage of your expenditures, you'll see that that in 22 you have 50.6% fund balance as a percentage of your expenditures. That is over obviously the 25%, and it's closer to 180 days. So TEA will ask for 75 days or 90 days, especially the Government Finance Officers Association, so you're well above that amount as well. Looking at your child nutrition and debt service funds, we look at that as well because you do adopt a budget on an annual basis, and you'll see that your revenues on the child nutrition department totaled $35.3 million, and they came under budget by $400,000. On the expenditure side, you still came under budget by $600,000. Your fund balance did increase by $5.7 million, and you have an ending fund balance of $11.8 million. And your team is evaluating that fund balance because anytime you exceed 90 days, you have to tell the Texas Department of Agriculture how you're going to spend that money and reinvest it into the program. It's not a bad issue to have, but it's a different view from the general fund where we want more than 90 days. Here they say keep it under 90 days. On the debt service fund, remember that you levy property taxes for principal and interest. And so the majority of that revenue, $101.6 million, were property taxes, and they came under, those revenues came above your budgeted amounts by $1 million, and then your expenditures, which is principal and interest and any other bond issuance cost, $109.3 million, came under budget by 1.3. Your fund balance decreased by $6.2 million. There was a $5 million contribution as part of a refunding that the district made out of the reserve, so that's always a good thing if you can reduce your debt with those district contributions. Your ending fund balance was $52.9 million. And then in August of 22, this past August, you had to turn around shortly after year end and make a $24.1 million interest payment. And so that's the reason too why you need a healthy fund balance to make those principal and or interest payments until the new, because you don't start collecting new property taxes till December, January of the next fiscal year. Any questions for me?
Any trustees with questions? I see Mr. Wilbanks. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. Great news.
Yes.
And we appreciate the work that you guys put in every year on this audit. It is a lot of work. And again, a clean bill of health, so kudos to our finance and accounting department. One just quick comment on page on the slide with the pie chart on the revenue.
Yes.
You mentioned the other federal revenue, the 33.3.
Yes.
That was the ESSER money that under kind of GAAP rules in the world, I'm not GASB, but that would have been revenue we should have recognized last year, but the way government accounting works is actually being recognized this year.
And actually, it was a new concept with the COVID funding that came in, just because a lot of these grants allow for pre-award cost. But the issue was that TEA did not actually issue a notice of grant award until after the fiscal year. So you really didn't have an award, but you had the pre-award cost.
And our expenses that it covered were
In prior
incurred
years,
prior
and you
year.
took a hit to your fund balance that year, and this year you're just replenishing that fund balance that you used in the prior year with the ESSER funds. So it's
Yeah.
really a timing issue. It's not that you're making all of this money there. It's just reimbursing you for prior year costs.
And I think in last year's report, we had in the MD&A, the management discussion analysis section, an explanation as to that mismatch between the revenue and the
Correct.
expenditures.
Correct.
And I assume there will be one
Yes.
this year as well.
Yes.
Okay, good. All
And
right.
I believe too, your management team on the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, they also identified the prior year amounts that are included in the federal awards too. So they did a good job in that too, to let the reader know.
Okay,
that too.
great. And that's all I had.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. I have Mr. Hibbs.
Thank you so much. I served on the board for several years before coming back this year, and we've had a great relationship with Whitley Penn, and thank you for all the efforts and the due diligence that you put in place. I would like to highlight our finance team also, because they have been nothing but spectacular and supporting you with this audit, and then also ensuring that our district is being good stewards of the community's trust and finances. And one last kudos that goes out, like I said, just coming back on the board for this 1 year, this board has, along with the superintendent and the team of 8, has done a very, very good job in being stewards for our community. And I would like to give you kudos also. I know this particular budget came under your leadership, Ms. Mays, and those of each one of you that served. So I will like to share with the public that I have great confidence with these board members and the superintendent in being good fiduciaries for our community, for the AISD, and all that's part of it.
Thank you, Mr. Hibbs. I have on my list Ms. Mays.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. If there's no other questions by my colleagues, I'd like to make a motion to move to approve the annual financial audit report for 2021-2022 fiscal year.
I have a motion by Ms. Mays. Is there a second?
I second.
Second by Mr. Wilbanks. Trustees, please cast your votes. All 5 board members present have voted in the affirmative. The vote is 5-0. Moving forward, that concludes our action agenda items for tonight. Moving on to our discussion items, we have one item, item A, the 2022-2023 financial update. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And tonight we bring the financial update as we do approximately once a month so that the board can consider this and also before our consent items. So Ms. Moss, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bussos. Vice President Chapa and trustees, again, I just want to bring a brief update of our financials, kind of share with you the state of the district. I'll start out with the 2022. Some of it may be a little repetitive from what Ms. Ceres just gave you, but we'll go through that fairly quickly, and then we'll end with our current year's information. So some of the financials in the board packet today, our monthly financial report as of September, our monthly investment report as of September, our budget amendment is as of November, and we also include some of the standard financials, our purchases greater than 50, our donations, bids, and salvage items. We also have included the 2022 tax roll, and our tax year started October 1st, so back in June, we kind of estimated what our taxable values would be. We have a better idea of that now that we have the actual tax roll for you for your approval tonight. This table just shows highlights of the Exhibit C3 that's in our audit report that was just presented, that you just approved. So all funds ended the year with a surplus in fund balance. With the exception of the debt service fund, our general operating ended with a surplus of $52 million, and that breakdown will be shared with you in an upcoming slide. Our debt service fund deficit of $6.2 million includes that $5 million contribution to refunded bonds that we did earlier in the year, and also a redemption of the bond series 2009 and 2013 that we did earlier in the year as well. That included some interest savings there. Our capital projects fund ended with a surplus of $498 million. That is just the funds that we're using currently, working on our 2019 bond projects. And our non-major governmental funds of $14.3 million for a total of $876 million in our fund balances for all funds. And so I wanted us to look at a breakdown again of the general operating fund balance. Ms. Ceres showed us that it was $296 million in general operating. That first grayed out column there shows the beginning fund balance by the component for the fiscal year 21-22, and that second column shows what the change was. She mentioned the $11 million for universal pre-K. That's the committed, that was committed by the board. The assigned amount of fund balance is just over $118 million. I wanted to break down what that is. The $60 million is for cash flow purposes for July and August, and our universal pre-K of 5.2, which is for the current year. The $11 million is for the next 2 years. That $5.2 million is for the current year. And we also assigned $53 million for capital projects as well. She noted that the $296 million was about 50% of our expenditures. So we know that we've identified at least $53 million of that for our 2019 capital projects and bond work. And so as I've been sharing before, I want to share again what the impact of ESSER was on this budget that's ending. Of course, that's our elementary and secondary school emergency relief money that we received from the federal government. We received $23.6 million for pre-award expenses and $10.3 million for ESSER 2 funds that were supplanted from 21-22. 5.4 is the indirect cost, and 5.6 were expenditures that were reclassified to ESSER 3 for a total of $45 million. So when you see that fund balance and where we netted out $52 million, $45 million of that was from our ESSER funding. And then I also wanted us to look at the adopted budget versus the actual budget. If you'll see, for the last 5 years, this is historical where the district has adopted a deficit budget. But if you'll look at the audited, we've ended up with a surplus and we've ended up in the positive. I wanted tonight to kind of break down what that swing is. We often refer to it as the swing. So for 21-22, if you'll look at that last column, it shows that our swing was $65 million. We adopted a deficit of 12.8. And we ended up in the positive of 52. But remember, a lot of that is our ESSER funds. So if the column on to the far right shows you where we would end if the ESSER funds were not included, we'd have a $19 million surplus without those included. So if you look historically, that's not as much as we've had, not as much of a swing as we've had in the past. So we've got to look at that a little closely and make sure that we analyze that as well going forward. And just to show you what that $65 million is made of, the ESSER impact was $29 million of it. The additional revenue for SHARs, the insurance that we brought for the budget amendment on last month, and then unspent funds. Those unspent funds were unfilled positions, unspent campus and department funds, and that was net of any overspending for a total of $25 million. That made up the $65 million swing. And so I want to move on to current year, the 22-23 budget. We are asking you to amend the budget tonight. Our general operating budget includes cross-functional changes. It has a revenue budget increase for insurance proceeds. The net change to general operating is $127,000. Our capital projects includes cross-functional changes. The expenditure budget has an increase for projects. The net change to capital projects is $410,000. Our child nutrition fund only includes cross-functional changes. There's no impact to the bottom line, and we're not asking for any amendment to the debt service or the natural gas fund tonight. So this is just a look at where we are with ESSER as of September 30th. Our ESSER 1 funds, again, are completely expended, and we've been reimbursed by the state for all those funds. ESSER 2, there is $16.4 million remaining. These funds must be expended by September 30th. We do have a plan for those to expend them and supplant them in current year to assist with the deficit budget for this year. And then our ESSER 3 has $95.4 million remaining, and those funds have to be expended by September of 2024. And just a quick look at our 2014 bond. The amount remaining there is $8.1 million. We have projects in process of $1.9 million. Again, this is as of September 30th. Our 2019 bond, we have an amount remaining of $396 million with $72 million in process right now, and that is as of September 30th as well. And so I wanted to kind of talk about what has changed since we adopted the budget in June. We have a better understanding of where our property values are. We estimated back in June to adopt the budget. We brought to you an amendment for property insurance. We added about $4 million to the budget. We're monitoring our attendance. The attendance has changed a little bit. We see a slight increase in attendance. It's still a little soon to determine where we would end. Typically, attendance goes down from snapshot in October to the end of the year, but we are currently monitoring that. We're looking at our unfilled positions and trying to monitor and quantify those on a monthly basis. We continue to monitor state funding, and of course, we're looking at our ESSER funding to see how we can support the general operating budget with that as well. The one in the middle is our focus point as well, that's recapture, and I'll talk about that on this next slide. So 4 points I want to make. We've talked about it in the past to where we're really close to recapture, and we've been really close to recapture before. The state, the Texas Education Agency typically identifies you as recapture in July. We were identified as Chapter 48, which is a non-recapture district. Recapture would be Chapter 49. So the first 6 weeks when we ran our numbers and ran it through the revenue template, we have an estimate of recapture of $509,000. Now that is just based on the first 6 weeks. Those numbers are subject to change. It could go up, it could go down. We could owe recapture, we could not owe recapture. It just depends on where we land at the end of the year. So based on the fact that we were identified as a Chapter 48 district, we can offset that recapture. If it ends up that we have to pay it at the end of the year, we can offset it with the FSP funds that we have, that we receive from the state. So therefore, since we can still offset those, we don't have to hold an election to pay that 509 if that's where we land at the end of the year, if that makes sense. And then finally, I just want to talk about some of the future financial considerations that we're looking at. We're monitoring that attendance rate really closely. Our T2 values, of course, we won't know the final values to let us know where our taxable values are going to end until late January. So we'll continue to monitor that. Our 2014 bond funds, we're really close to closing those out. Once we pay all of those and close it out, the remainder will be moved into capital projects. We'll bring that to the board for your approval probably the first of the year. Our oil and gas fund, I think we said earlier, we have about 14 million plus there. We will bring that to the board as well for a transfer of those funds to close that out and transfer them into our capital project funds as well to assist with our 2019 bond work. We're going to continue to monitor recapture. It's something that we know every 6 weeks we'll run that revenue template to see how much we may have to pay in recapture this year, if we have to pay anything at all, just based on where our numbers come in at. ESSER funding, we're watching that on a regular basis as well. And then we have cost management initiatives to try to help us to resize the budget or our general operating budget to line it out to where it needs to be. So we're looking at attendance. We have an initiative for attendance. We have an initiative where we're working on our ESSER funding and how do we use these ESSER fundings to support our general operating budget. We have items that we're looking at for FTEs, our FTE management and control. So there are a lot of cost management initiatives that we are currently working on to help support the general operating budget and the work that we have ahead to try and get our budget in line. And I'm glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Moss. Trustees, are there any questions? Ms. Mays.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. Thank you, Ms. Moss, very much for this presentation. Just a couple of things. I love seeing students out in our audience, so there's a few things I'm just gonna ask, just give a little bit more explanation. On the general operating fund balance slide for our assigned amounts for July and August cash flow, can you just give a short description as to why we need to set that money aside for those particular months?
Yes, ma'am. Let me see if I can get back to that one. Is that the one you're speaking of, the 60?
Yes.
So we set those funds aside basically to assign them because typically people look at the fund balance as it's our savings account. This is how much money we have. Well, that's how much money we had at one point in time. As of June 30th, that's how much money we've had, but we've already spent that because we have expenditures that come in that are for the last fiscal year, and we don't receive dollars from the state until August, September, which is for the next fiscal year. So those, we assign that portion to cover those expenditures, and that's our estimate of 2 months' worth of expenditures.
Thank you. I also just wanted to say I really do appreciate on our adopted budget versus our actual budget and just showing the past 5 years of how we adopted the budget at what is here deficits, and then we end up in surplus. I really like how you explained that that's not just because we picked numbers and they weren't quite right, but there's so many things that we're not certain of. So our financial department takes a very conservative approach because we'd much rather say that here's money that we're not going to have versus we're going to have and then have to explain why we don't. So I really do appreciate you taking out the time to show what made up that $65 million swing that you would call it. And as you look, a lot of those things were things that could not be estimated at that particular time or even controlled. So I really do appreciate you pulling that out to explain what that is. Okay, and then for the short discussion of our recapture and explaining how that would be determined by the end of what would be July 2023, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Just my personal opinion, I mean, we may be in an area that is tax property rich, but that does not account for the large percentage of students and families that we have that have needs that still need to be met, but that's my personal opinion. So for the end of the year, I did hear you said, I just want to make sure every 6 weeks, we're going to kind of reevaluate that if we were subjected to a recapture, that we would have that amount kind of already known what it may be.
Yes, ma'am. There's a revenue template that we use, and based on the numbers that we have, our student attendance, our demographics, we run it through this revenue template, and it shows us whether or not we are going, or how much money we should estimate for recapture for the end of the year. And we do that every 6 weeks when we get that data.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are my questions, and once again, I appreciate the transparency. Thank you, Ms. Motz.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mays. Dr. Cavazos?
Yeah, just a quick comment on this slide while you're on it there. We're not required to hold an election unless a different threshold is met. Is that right, Ms.
That
Motz?
is true. Because we receive money, FSP funds from the state, currently we receive approximately $130 million. So unless our recapture amount is $130 million plus, we don't have to hold an election. And believe it or not, there are some districts that do have to hold an election who do all of their, that amount of money is having to be paid out for recapture. But we're not there yet.
Dr. Cavazos, thank you. We'll move on to Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. So Darla, I agree with everything Ms. Mays said about we appreciate the conservative approach. I would like, generally I think we're under 10% of where we end up in our actuals versus our budget, even though we adopt a deficit budget. But there are a lot of factors in these last couple of years with COVID, with the disruption to attendance, being that that's the primary driver of our revenue from the state. That's made it very difficult to do our budgets and to have them get as close as possible to what where we actually end up. So I know it's been very, very difficult. My main concern is, though, on the attendance. You mentioned that our attendance is greater than what we had estimated going in because we're conservative. It was trending well, but you did mention that it tends to dip especially this time of year when flu season crops up and we start seeing a lot of absences. Has that natural dip, especially during flu season, been factored into our annualized revenue projections based on where we are now with our, or are you guys taking that into account? And if so, how?
Whenever we actually estimate what we think our attendance rate might be, it's based on historical data. We don't, focus on flu season or anything like that. We're focusing on the whole. So typically, at the beginning of school, everybody's excited, but then they start to kind of, for different reasons, they may, not attend school. That's one of the initiatives that we're working on. But it's historical, and it's not just Arlington. School districts typically, attendance drops from snapshot in October to the end of the year. So we take that into consideration when we're calculating that.
Okay, good. And then, having known that, going forward in terms of trying to make our budgets to actuals a little tighter within that 10% window, is it getting easier now? Are we through the hump? And is there anything that you're planning on doing in terms of tightening up the BTAs going forward?
And so I think looking at our FTE management and looking at our unfilled positions would help with that a lot. That would help us, I guess, when we're initiating the budget or creating the budget initially, to say, historically for the last 5 years, we've had X amount of unfilled positions, and so we can kind of quantify that to see where we are. I think that could vary, because where you get into trouble is, okay, I'm going to account for, I have $30 million in unfilled positions for the last 3 years. Well, this year I'm going to fill half of them. So that's where you kind of have to manage that and analyze it to make sure you don't go the other direction, like Ms. Mays was saying earlier.
Yeah.
So it's part of it. Even with COVID, prior to COVID, we still had to look at it like that, to where the work that we do requires a crystal ball that we just don't have, and we just kind of have to estimate based on history where we think we're going to land.
Yeah, and that was really difficult when we were in unprecedented times.
Absolutely.
That we couldn't gauge off of, that were anything but normal times. So, no, again, we really appreciate the work your team has done through those extraordinary times and helping us get to where we are. And we have more than a healthy fund balance, but we also have a lot of needs in terms of getting students back on track. No, we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Are there any further questions from trustees? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Moss.
Thank you.
We'll now move forward to the next item on our agenda. That's the last, that is the end of item A. We'll move on to our consent agenda. Consent agenda consists of routine items for the board's consideration that are grouped together for approval as one item. Unless an item is removed from the consent agenda, we will act on these items at one time with no discussion. Trustees, are there any requests for items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Move approval of the consent agenda as presented.
I have a motion from Mr. Wilbanks.
Second.
I have a second from Dr. Reich. Trustees, please vote. All 5 trustees have voted in the affirmative. The consent agenda passes 5-0. We'll now move on to our other discussion items for the evening. Discussion item B, TRS Active Care Update. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And tonight we bring for your consideration and discussion a TRS Active Care Update. And if you recall, we presented an update before and outlined for the board a path that we would follow to get input from staff We have a wonderful committee and wonderful members here with us. And so we are at that point. If, as a reminder, we have until December to decide if we leave TRS Active Care or if we remain in TRS Active Care. And so the work that the committee's done in our HR department, I want to thank you ahead of time. There are a lot of moving pieces, including recent things that have changed and adapted that you all have had to consider. So I just sincerely appreciate it, because amidst everything else, you're trying to get input on a very, very important topic, and we're trying to make a recommendation for the board. So tonight, I'll turn it over to Mr. Kale to lead us off, and then we'll hear from some of our committee members.
Thank you. Good evening, Vice President Chapa, board members, and Dr. Cavazos. Thank you for having us. I do have Kevin Knierim and Sherry Sheridan with me, members of our employee advisory team on this matter, and we'll have words from them near the end. They're going to take the tail end of the presentation. I'll try and move quickly through some of this. I recognize it is it's been gone through before. I think it was important to set the stage before we end up with the ultimate recommendation, so it has context this evening. But we'll cover how do we get here, alternative plans to TRS Active Care, plan benefit and cost comparisons, the primary consortium that we looked at as an alternative, which was the TSHBP, employee survey results, and then the takeaways and the steering committee's recommendation. This is very similar, if not in many cases identical, to what we provided and showed employees when we were trying to get their inputs, both through online. A good portion of this presentation was available, as was a voiceover to help employees have the background to express their views through our employee survey, and again, a similar content that we showed in a number of employee sessions that were available to our population. So the overview that we started with, as a reminder, was how we got here, and TRS Active Care really not having an option to get out until recently. And then, of course, recently with legislation changes in the last few years, Senate Bill 1444 and otherwise, giving us that opportunity. And so with that, we have options available to us that were not available to us before. And we can exercise those once a year up to the point where we chose to get out, if that were ever to occur, and then we'd be out for 5 years with whatever option that was. You wouldn't be able to get back to TRS Active Care until that 5 years had passed. We looked at our approach to change, or at least consideration of change, in two distinct phases. One, identifying the need, and then two, identifying the considerations. So communicating the active care alternatives to employees through the emails, the videos, and so forth that I mentioned. Initially providing the first survey that we shared the results on the last time that we were here with you, and then targeted employee steering committee meetings and the gracious participation of some of our employees who gave their time and their inputs as a result. Once we got through that first phase, then in phase two, we went into in-person sessions, online recordings, virtual office hours. It was important to all of us that this was, particularly me, that this was a consensus input recommendation. This affects all of us. This isn't affecting people in administration. It's not affecting HR. It's affecting all of us as individual employees, and it was important to all of us, me in particular, that we had those inputs. As a result, we offered that second survey. We have those results to share with you as we've shared them to date now with the steering committee, and then steering committee meetings to review that ultimately turning into recommendation of whether the committee believes that they recommend the board to take action or not in terms of getting out of TRS Active Care for this particular cycle. So outcomes and takeaways from that first phase, recognizing the different needs of the populations and the challenge that no single approach was going to accommodate all of our employees or perfectly fit the needs and interests of every individual. Premiums and cost-related concerns are predominantly rated at a higher level of importance among our employees. That came out loud and clear in the first survey. The TRS Active Care premiums were offset by federal ESSER funding in this last cycle by the state. And so while the regional rating took effect and without question would have had a impact to the rates that we paid in this last, or for that matter, current benefit cycle. Well, the rate went up, the cost was paid for through federal ESSER funds provided by the state and neutralized that, so the employee didn't necessarily experience that, but it's still there, and the likelihood of further adjustments just from a cost of living standpoint will be incremental to that. And then it was our best interest to actively pursue and develop alternative plans, at least to determine if there were other choices that made sense. So we narrowed down those other choices to what we call fully insured, self-insured, and the consortium pool that I mentioned a moment ago, which was TSHBP. And we looked and took the employees, and I'll move relatively quickly through these slides. I'm happy to back up later if you have an interest in any further detail, but I want to get to the core of this, and what I'm going through at the moment is really just an explanation that we took all of our staff, or at least provided the opportunity to take all of our staff through the content of each one of these options, the benefits and the restrictions of fully insured plans, which are effectively where the carrier, the Aetna or the Blue Cross or whomever services the account, and then they're responsible for the liability or loss, benefits from profit, and it's effectively off the shelf. So you're buying a product that's fixed in the way it provides services, and the insurer is taking the risk, and you're paying the premium that they believe that they can make a profit on. Self-funded carrier or the Aetna, Blue Cross or whomever services the account, the district's responsible for loss, as opposed to the carrier being responsible for loss. With that, you also have flexibility of building more into the structure of how the benefits are offered, how the plan is managed, and that's really the trade-off in that particular option. And then there's the consortium, which is relatively new. This particular one is, it's going into, I believe it's third year. It's a smaller group in the mid to high 40s right now in terms of school districts that are in it. It was initially developed with the intent of participating school districts who are looking for different cost options and a little bit more flexibility and control in plan design around cost controls built into the plan. And initially, it had a number of similarities that were positive when we first looked at it in this phase one, as I described, to TRS active care. So the transition may not have been as stark and difficult if we had in fact, or do in fact make that recommendation. And on the other hand, it also had plans that were built into it as options if the district was to make that transition, that had quite a bit of cost containment alternatives and structure that were part of it, so that if an employee moved, if we moved as a district and the employee said, I want to stay as close to what I had as possible, those plans were available and the corresponding cost was also similar. I really want something, on the other hand, maybe that is lower in cost that I can afford. I'm not as concerned about whether there's a referral or whether there's a concierge for a hospital, and I get lower cost. And the consortium initially told us that both of those were within their particular offering. When we got down to it and thought about buying plans off the shelf, thought about building our own, those two things for a variety of reasons were not at the top of the list in terms of what was realistic or advantageous, in our opinion, to district employees. And so we narrowed it down to staying with TRS Active Care as a recommendation, or looking seriously at this consortium pool as it provided those options that I mentioned a moment ago. So we took our employees in this phase two through the detail to help them understand whether they were looking at it on PowerPoint online, or whether they came to one of the sessions, or whether they called the office during virtual office hours, to try and show them how those plans broke out, what it was really like. And we recognize this is a pretty complex, involved information, and we wanted to put as much out there as we could for people who had the interest in doing so, to educate and get up to speed. This is the kind of slide that makes everybody go to sleep, so I'll try and move quickly. And I've done this for a long time, and I'm still at risk up here. So what we're showing up here is it highlights in colored screen, but the rest is gray, is really what we were trying to tell employees the differences were. The other things are important, and they have merit in their own right, but really the differentiation that we were trying to seek out to determine if it was viable and if it made sense and if the steering committee thought it was worth the trade-off of the change, were the differences in the deductibles, because that's what we'd heard in the survey. It was about cost, about where employees thought they had the greatest interest and concerns. So when you looked at the active care high deductible, well, we tried to compare that to the consortium high deductibles. And you see family versus individual versus family in TRS at 3,000 or 6,000. And you see, again, very similar in Aetna high deductible for the consortium, 3,000 versus 6,000, identical. But then you go into directed care, and it's not much different. So not a lot of change there, but there's a lot of change when you get to coinsurance, which we all know is, you know, that amount of money you pay when you show up at the doctor's office or you go to a clinic. And you can see in that what I was calling a cost containment part of the plan and the consortium, that on that far right, there is no coinsurance. The plan pays 100% after the deductible. So it's those kinds of things that we're trying to point out to our employees versus the alternatives as you move to the left of that screen that are in the 30% versus the 100% of coinsurance. And then again, just trying to highlight the difference in cost of where employees said they were interested in understanding more. You've got a 3,000 far right in the blue. You've got a 3,000 individual, 9,000 family for in-network out-of-pocket maximum for the consortium. And that compares when you scroll to the left to 7,000 versus 14,000. Now, someone in your family gets hurt or seriously ill and goes to the hospital. We all know that hitting that 7 or 14,000 can happen really fast. And there's a difference between saying, well, I've got to figure out how to cover 7,000 versus I have to cover 3, or I have to figure out how to cover 9,000 versus 14. And that's the kind of differences that we were trying to give employees alternatives and choice to. And then, well, those were high deductible comparisons, did the same kind of thing here in terms of looking at what weren't the high deductible plans between TRS and the consortium, but more what we're used to in terms of PPO type plans. Same idea. TRS, you know, the family deductible's 2,000 versus 5 for a family. You go to the far right, it's 0 and 0. But there are steps that are built into the process of care, and whether it be how the process works to pay for specialty drugs or high cost drugs, or a referral in terms of a hospitalization. Not an emergency necessarily, but a scheduled one. Still showing differences in out-of-pocket when you look at the difference between TRS Active Care Primary, that second column, 6,900 individual, 13,800. Similar plan on the far right, not 6,900 and 13,800, but rather 3,000 and 10,000. I was asked for quite a while when we were first putting alternatives together, how big a difference is it? And the reality is it's relative. It makes a difference to the individual. People are going to have their own thresholds of what is a lot or enough and what is not. And so the only way we knew to share that was by showing the actual numbers. So the next piece of information we tried our best to share with employees was, well, in the current, we're not going to have next year's rates. The underwriting doesn't occur until few months before the plans are effective for obvious reasons, and so you can't really share last year's rates. And then the complications of this particular plan year was that federal ESSER funding I mentioned that the state infused into TRS and effectively bought down what otherwise would have been a pretty substantial increase in the regional rating impact to Region 11 where we sit. So what we did do is we worked with our consultants, and we effectively were able to identify the dollar figure that was infused and divide it proportionately among the plans. And it's 130 or something if you do the math in terms of the amount that we showed on each plan. And this is the best projection mathematically that we could come to that we felt was both conservative and accurate. But it is a projection. So the red numbers are intended to project if ESSER funds had not been applied, what would the rates have been? Now, these aren't facts, these are projections, but to the best of our ability, we believe the red is a fair projection. So when we talk to our employees, and we want to make sure that they understood what choices and what inputs they were giving, it isn't necessarily that the employee only in TRS Active Care Primary, that very top left-hand corner, number 417, was 417. It was probably 549, and these are before district contribution and so forth. But it was probably 549, but the employee in the district only got charged 417. But the moment that ESSER funding is no longer available, if the 549 is accurate, it still applies, and it's going to be subject to whatever additional cost of living adjustments go on top of that. So if you're used to 417 and it was really 549, it's not unrealistic that you're going to feel a difference of 417 now going to something like 620, if that makes sense. And it's going to feel bigger because what's happened to date has been insulated by that grant funding. And then there's different examples of the different plans, but I think that covers the point that we were trying to share with our employee members. So we got an update in that the consortium was really one of our, well, if not the primary alternative that we narrowed it down to in terms of what is viable if in fact a recommendation was to be made to step away from TRS Active Care in this coming plan year. And we had our arms around it pretty well, we thought, and then really within just the last 2 to 3, 4 weeks at most, there have been a number of changes. And I'll attribute those changes to nothing but good faith on the part of the consortium and its representatives. There's been no issue there whatsoever, in my opinion. However, they are a very new business model. They are continuing to evolve. And with that business model and with the fluid dynamics of the healthcare cost industry in total, they've had, it appears, to make modifications as well. And those impact whether these decisions are viable on the part of the district to consider them as an alternative to TRS Active Care. So those include their premium rates that we would assume are no longer guaranteed to match or stay below TRS Active Care, and that was something that was shared with us on the front end of these discussions. Consortium, regional rating is now applicable. It was not previously. So just like TRS has moved to regional rating in terms of costing out premiums, the consortium is also using it as part of their formula. High cost, often called specialty drugs, are subject to a patient assistance program, which is effectively a two-step process. It's not overly burdensome, but it is a process that for those that need specialty drugs, they would go through an application process that allows the consortium to get the best price, to use industry-based coupons, to use federal funding when available. So it could feel burdensome, and that is now part of the process. And they're putting cost controls in place from their business model, I have no doubt. High-cost drugs are now defined as $500 or more per prescription. It was previously $670, so that threshold has dropped. Obviously would include more drugs in that list as a result. And district claims data is now required to determine premiums. So it's no longer one size fits all. I get into the consortium and there's a consortium premium. It's, in our case in particular, as was recently explained to us, a 75%, 25% weighting, 75% on district claims experience, 25% based on Region 11. Not greatly differentiating from really the way premiums are calculated in other plans, including TRS Active Care. This just unpacks that a little bit more. I've probably spoken to much of this already, but unlike TRS, the consortium doesn't currently receive funding from the state, so they're in a position they have to be able to economically survive without that. The increase in healthcare costs is going to lead to an increase in premium rates, and their business model, as I mentioned, is still evolving. Talked about regional rating being applicable, talked about the high-cost drugs and what that means, and then the claims data now being required was a modification. So impact of a claims data review, hard to get that information, has been in the past, but there is more receptivity to it. I did just sign off on the request to get it, because no matter what we do, we want to have that information. And when I want to say out loud publicly, when I say claims data, we're not getting information down to the individual or the name or anybody's personal situation. We're getting an aggregate roll-up where you can take a look at what are your top 20% of cost of conditions, but it's not going to have Scott's name or anybody else's name or condition, because privacy is obviously a critical part of this management of this process. When we looked at our most recent data that we did have, Arlington in 2021 was at 106% utilization of our premiums with TRS Active Care. So the short story to that means that we're paying in less than we're claiming. We're getting the benefit of being in the group because we're charging the group with our claims, or had been at that time, 106% of what we were contributing. Updated claims information previously being requested, I mentioned, so that's in process to get updated information, and we'll look at that with the steering committee once it's received. And I think I covered the rest. Okay, this is the second survey now, and this is the one that we put out since our last presentation. And despite all of the avenues I told you that we attempted to open, whether it be the online slides and voiceovers or the in-person meetings at different facilities throughout the district and at different times as well, to see if that would help, the participation was low, and 65 employees attended one of 7 sessions, and only 208 online recording views occurred. And you know what, I'm not just trying to be positive, there is value and positivity in everything, because there's a message there in terms of pull and what's important, and it's as important to get that feedback as it is to get feedback to the contrary. 1,625 employees did start the survey. 1,475 of those completed it. Interestingly enough, the other 150 or so, whatever that number is between those two, chose not to answer the last questions, which was kind of the punchline of, do you want to stay in or do you want to move to the consortium? So that was interesting as well. Our total current enrollment in medical coverage is just under 5,000, which is about 58% of our full-time employees. And our full-time employees are just over 8,400. 85% of survey participants were enrolled in an active care plan. The other 15% were not currently enrolled. What'll be interesting, this shows the demographic breakdown of who's in which plan by percent. It's fairly proportionate to what we expected. This is very reflective of the previous survey, what's most important, and you see a lot of emphasis and responses here in terms of their priority being cost at 41%, then it drops down to 18% in terms of network availability of doctors. Not that that's unimportant, but it was rated much higher on the cost element. The changes from the prior survey, what I was starting into a moment ago, I was just a little bit early, is that watch the colors on this pie chart as I go through some of these slides. It's actually going to be coming in a few slides, but you'll see them shrink, and I'll explain that in a minute. So did you participate in the survey that was distributed in May? 36% did, 26% did not, 38% did not remember. How concerned are you with the following if the district stays in TRS Active Care? The obvious Pareto there is premiums being too high, out-of-pocket maximum being too high, co-pays being too high, again, all related to cost. How concerned are you if the district joins the consortium? Still fairly similar to the same level of concern in terms of order of subjects, but not as dramatic, a little bit lower, 77% at the top versus 81% at the top on that previous slide for TRS Active Care. This is where their colors will shrink a little bit. because the slide in the pie charts represents the two questions that we asked at the end of the survey, and it's what I called the punchline a moment ago. What do you think the district should do to best suit the needs of? First question was you and your family. Same thing was, what should the district do in the best interests of all employees? Because sometimes people have a different perception of what that means. Well, it's okay for me. Well, I'm really concerned about everybody else, or vice versa. So in orange, you can see that that represents joining the consortium, and blue means staying with active care. Gray is no response. It's those folks I told you that chose not to answer the last two questions. Pretty similar between the two questions in terms of the pie chart. Not a lot of difference, a little bit more in terms of should move. And you, to the consortium, 50% versus 47. But what's interesting is when you go to the next slide and you start to think, well, it's not a big edict, it's not a big mandate there, but there's a little bit in terms of saying, yep, let's go to the consortium. But of what percent? Now look how the colored portions of the pie shrunk. And what this really points out is this is now as a percent of all healthcare participants. So if you only look at the people who responded, and we know the response level was low, you say, well, there's interest, not overwhelming, but there's interest. But when you take into consideration, but wait, we had all these folks that, despite being aware of it, didn't feel the pull to say, yes, let's do this. It really is not indicating the same level of even being close to a mandate. And then you say, well, what is it not of healthcare participants? What is it of the total population that could be in healthcare, because all full-time employees are eligible? And it comes down to really only 9% of employees are saying, let's join the consortium. So it was important to me that even if people didn't express their voices, that we tried to interpret that in the most accurate way we could. We also looked at exempts and non-exempts to say, okay, is there a difference in how people are answering these questions? Based on cost, based on salary levels? Are people who are at higher salary levels saying, sure, I'm fine where I'm at, it's all good, don't change? And people maybe at lower levels of salary saying, no, this is really hurting me, and I need to change even if there's some plan changes. And what we found was there really wasn't much difference. People were answering pretty consistently. So takeaways and recommendations. I'm going to turn this over to Kevin and Sherry and let them take you through the discussions that this data was then translated to in terms of the steering committee conversation.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Dr. Cavazos, members of the board. We appreciate the time here. And as I start, I just want to first of all thank Mr. Kell and his staff for not only the work that they've done providing us with this data, but also including the employee voice in this and getting our feedback on what we think that we want. So at the beginning of this, as Mr. Kell went through the data and the information with us, we were tasked with this question. Based on your personal opinion, the opinion of other employees you've spoken with, and your assessment of the data, do you believe that AISD should remain in TRS active care for the 23-24 school year or transition to the TSHBP consortium? So with that task to us, we looked at the data, we talked, we had some pretty deep discussions within our group, and these were the takeaways that we came up with. As Mr. Kell mentioned, the percentage or the percent and numbers of employees who engaged in the process was minimal. There was no significant employee preference on the two options that were available, that we felt were the best. There was no significant difference between salaried and non-salaried. The updates and revisions to the TSHB consortium illustrate the stability of the plan still is in development. As we mentioned, it's still fairly new, so there's still a lot of moving parts in it, appears. And then with the updated consortium model, is basically the same as the fully insured that we had looked at in phase one and early in phase two. Also, the additional year of federal ESSER or other funding from the state for the active care plan will not be known until after the 12/31 deadline, so there's still that unknown there as well. And one of the bigger ones was that the consortium rates no longer are guaranteed to stay at or below the active care rate. So that was kind of, as we talked, we started, okay, we've got a safety net, we're good. Now then, we're concerned that it's going to go up more than even TRS. And then also that the AIS wellness programs may be a vehicle to more aggressively reduce claim expense and provide the district with some cost reduction plan alternatives in the future. So after discussing and looking at those takeaways, these are the recommendations that we came up with as a committee. One, for the 23-24 school year, so for next school year, remain in TRS active care. And then complete and the request to analyze the experience data alternatives beyond 23-24 school year, which, as Mr. Kell mentioned, he's already asked for, and we'll get together and look at that information. And then also to schedule a standing steering committee meetings through the 22-23 school year, serving three purposes. For a high-level review of the experience and trends that we're seeing with our data and within the insurance markets, review the TRS rates that are published in the spring of 2023, and then maintain an understanding of employee inputs with the changing landscape of the benefit alternatives and the cost and cost management considerations that may come about from that. So based on that, those are our recommendations. Any questions, anything that we can answer for y'all?
Questions from the trustees? Dr. Reich.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. Thank you all for the presentation. I appreciate the takeaways. I have a question. Might be for you. On the second survey, did the participants have the updated info or not as far as the consortium adjustments to what their plan was going forward?
I can answer that. They did not.
Okay. Because
we just, as a committee, found out about it last week.
That's what I was thinking. So that's telling on its own, because the data that you're presenting, I'm like, okay, I see where this is going. We're sold. Here we are. We're moving to the consortium plan. So I was really surprised. So that's really telling that the employees are still, no, I think we're okay. And it's interesting to me, I understand as far as a business model, they're trying to increase or maintain profitability in the consortium. Tea leaves might say it's potentially falling apart. That's kind of what I see in it. The changes that you identified, Mr. Kale, as far as the 75%, 25%, that's kind of the point of the consortium. And we do have realized that benefit being as part of TRS Active Care. As you pointed out, we're at 6% over it right now. And I will say, as a credit to you, to this board, it was probably about 4 years ago, I think, in the legislative session where we were hammering trying to get that data. So thank you for that previous work, because now we can actually make informed decisions, better informed decisions, having access to that data moving forward. It's unfortunate. I was really liking what I was hearing. I thought, wow, this is amazing. How can I get on this thing? And the lack of a guarantee that it will be less than TRS Active Care, that's a big red flag. To me, all of those point to potential implosion, and they got one more year at it, and then they're going to fizzle out. Kind of wish we had Mr. Hogg still here to kind of talk about those tea leaves, being he's the industry insider there to a degree, but that's what I see. So I do appreciate the work. How survey participants were able to grasp all of this, I don't know. I know our students in the room, you guys got all this stuff, right? This is technical. This is hard to grab a hold of. So because of those factors, I absolutely see the ideas behind it. There is a piece of me, if all of the data was still very supportive without those recent changes, I would then start questioning, well, people are kind of resistant to change.
and those numbers are still kind of insignificant, that kind of points to me that people are like, yeah, it's okay, it's not moving the needle much, whatever. There's always a resistance to change, so, but we don't have to have that discussion, in my opinion. Okay, so as far as timeline, next steps, will this require any board action if we don't do anything? I don't think it would, but just to clarify.
No, sir, it won't.
Okay.
Only if the board intends to remove us for the next year from TRS active care.
Right, okay. Okay, well, that's great, and I presume this probably went through Finance Committee as a discussion, or, no, not yet? Oh, okay. Okay, I was just interested if they had any thoughts on that too. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you being here and going through this. Having the actual stakeholders that are literally footing the bill on this stuff is so important. So I appreciate you representing everybody and taking a part in it. It means a lot to us as a governing oversight board to know that that process is taking place to honor the employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. Ms. Mays?
It's not on. There we go. Now we got it. Thank you, Vice President Chapa. I concur with most of what Dr. Reich said. But first of all, just thank you very much. As mentioned, this board and Bowie Hogg definitely was an initial advocate, but really have been looking for ways to help decrease the cost of healthcare for our full-time employees. And it has been difficult. I personally was happy to say, here, y'all take a look and tell us, what else we can do. So first of all, really appreciate you not only taking the task, but taking it very seriously, the inclusiveness of all the different representatives within the group on the committee, I really appreciate. Thank you for taking time, and thank you for stating how you're going to continue to take time, because to your point, don't know if ESSER's going to kick in to help supplant some of those costs. If they don't, that survey may look real different if we do it again in the future. Also, seeing the consortium with the 40 groups that are included currently, if that were to go up with additional districts being involved, will that start to make a difference? But I just really appreciate the information that has been given back and the continued research that will be done. But just thank you very much for insightful information and for the board and the district being willing to research the information for the choices versus us just either saying no or yes. So thank you, Mr. Kell, for all of the work that you've done in pulling together all of this research as well. Thank you.
Thank y'all for allowing us.
Yes, thank you. And we want to really thank the HR team because they did the bulk of the work and they just presented it to us and said, okay, what do you think? But as someone who does participate in TRS Active Care, this was extremely important to me, and I'll be forever grateful that we got to have our voice heard, because I learned a whole lot during this process. Probably more than I will ever need to know, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful because it has allowed me to go out and spread the word, so to speak, and tell others. And the bottom line that I've learned is that healthcare is expensive, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And so, knowing what the options are, and knowing that we did not have that safety net, I think was the biggest factor in our decision, because the safety net was very attractive. And once that was taken away, I was like, oh, wait a minute. And I really believe at least another year and revisit, or maybe a few years. So thank you so much for allowing us to participate.
Thank you. Mr. Wilbanks?
Thank you, Vice President Chapa, and I'm going to also echo the comments of my colleagues here and my gratitude for your committee and the work that they've done, and and giving a voice to those who are most affected by this decision. I concur with the analysis that Dr. Rice said. I think over at the site he said it was like a bomb that just went off in the last week that just kind of derailed where this was heading. And so I want to say I also concur with all of the committee's recommendations. We absolutely need to stay in TRS active care for another year and look and see and examine. And I also agree with continuing to involve the committee as a standing committee to analyze as we go forward to see if maybe unlike what we're seeing with that bomb that went off, that the consortium looks like it's imploding. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it recovers, or maybe there's another alternative that crops up over the year. As long as my colleague Mr. Chapa and I been involved in the Financial Futures Committee since 2011, and this perennially is the biggest issue that we as citizens wanted to tackle and solve for the employees of this district. And there wasn't anything. I mean, the fact that we got to the point where we were allowed to exit was amazing, because it was, as people described back then, Cindy Powell, our former CFO, it was a pact with the devil. Once you were in, you could never leave, like Hotel California. We were checked in and locked in. But here we are again, where we think we might have a viable option, but it looks like the best course of action is to continue in at least for another year. So again, thank you, and I will wholeheartedly support your recommendations.
And Mr. Wilbanks, thank you for that also. But one of the things that you mentioned is one of the kind of things we didn't mention is that if we get out of TRS, we're out for 5 years. So if that bomb came next year, then we're really in trouble. Whereas in this situation, okay, let's step back, let's look at it for a year, and we can make the same decision this time next year. So it just gives us that extra. So your point to that is very well taken. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to add one short thing, we're certainly happy if there are any other questions, but the perception of whether we can or cannot impact healthcare, I want to just publicly state I 100% believe we can impact the cost of healthcare, 100%. And to oversimplify it, and it's going to sound trite, but it's not intended to be. The way you avoid healthcare costs is not by getting sick. The way you avoid healthcare costs is meaningful programs that drive personal wellness, that are good for the employee and good for the cost of healthcare. And it's doable and it's viable, but it's something that the committee will look at as we look at data, as we look at a high level of what 80% of our costs are in 20% of our conditions, what the proactive actions are to do something meaningful, how that can be built into our wellness program going forward in a structured process kind of way versus a, kind of hope for the best. And I know there's data to support it. I know I have experience that supports it. We can make that difference, and I think this is not the end. This is, in my opinion, a good recommendation for now, but it's not as though we've hit the end of the road. This is the right turn at the right time, and there's a lot of work to be done that can have very positive effects.
Any further questions or comments from trustees? Thank you again, Mr. Kale. It was really a good presentation. The real irony, I think, for those of us who've been looking into this issue for several years now, is we started out beating up folks saying we got to get out of TRS active care, and the real irony is for now that we have the choice, we might be staying in TRS active care for a while. That's why we wanted the choice. Thank you all for your service, and I do. It's interesting that Mr. Wilbanks referenced our committee service before we got on the board, and one of the things that was always neat to see, and I know happened to us, especially after your first involvement, is you come in with, you think you understand how things work, and there's such a big learning curve, and then you find out things sometimes are just really complicated, and it's not as easy as it seems to make the change that you might want to.
Sir. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you all.
Did not have Mr. Wilbanks making an Eagles reference on my bingo card tonight. Darn. Move on now to our final discussion item of the evening. This is discussion item C, preliminary 2023 A through F academic accountability system refresh. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. And to continue with the upbeat topics, we will tonight have a presentation about the changes that are at least being considered with the A through F accountability system. And I'll just preface it by saying what I have said before. We call it a refresh because the state calls it a refresh, but it's not a refresh. It really is a big change. It's a huge change. And it's not final. So what we bring tonight is what so far has been discussed. And so it's with that kind of balance that this is what's been discussed, but many times what's been discussed in the past has actually turned out to be the system. And there are some big changes. And we'll have some commentary about that, but this time I'll turn it over to Dr. Lopez to lead us through the presentation.
Thank you, sir. Interim President Chapa, members of the board, and Dr. Cavazos, thank you for your time.
That would be a promotion. Thank you, though.
Thank you for your time. I'll discuss the preliminary 2023 A to F academic accountability system refresh this evening. And as Dr. C said, it's very it's proposed at this time, so this is subject to change. I'll start with the accountability calculation overall. That methodology right now remains unchanged. We're still going to look at 70% of either your student achievement or your school progress, the better of those two, three domains if you consider the parts for two. So the better of those is 70%, and then the remaining 30% is closing the gaps. So I'll now move into the domain proposals. So domain 1 is student achievement. That's still consistent. And there are no changes for the calculations or the weighting for campuses. So elementaries are still going to be 100% star, middle schools also 100% star, and then high schools and then any campuses that are K through 12 are 40% star, 40% CCMR, and then 20% graduation. Now the scaling for domain 1 will change. The methodology will remain the same, but the scaling will change. So they're going to use pre and post COVID star results as the baseline data. The average of that data is supposed to scale to a mid-C. And then the star component for the A letter grade cut point will remain at a raw of a 60. And that's what it is now. It's going to remain there. And then the cut points for the rest of the letter grades for the different pieces will be released January 1st, 2023, or scheduled to be released by January 1st. Now, there is a proposal to change up the way they're doing accelerated testers. So, tell you a little bit about how they do that now. So, accelerated testers are students that are in 8th grade that take an EOC. So, Algebra 1, English 1, Biology. Well, when they take that EOC as an 8th grader, it goes to the junior high that they're attending. Their score goes to the junior high they're attending for their campus calculations. So then when they're a 9th grader and they don't have an EOC for math or for science, and then for some students, if they take English 1 or English 2 in their junior high, then they won't have a reading score. So they don't have a score that goes into accountability calculations for their high school. So this past year, any student that was one of those 8th graders 4 years ago, that was a senior this last year, they pulled in their SAT or ACT score, and they categorized the SAT and the ACT with performance levels that aligned to STAR, since they didn't have any STAR score, or any EOC score that ever went into their high school calculation. So that's what they did this last year in 2022. What they're proposing is that instead of doing that and waiting for 8th graders to finally get to their senior year to be included in the accountability calculation is, if they have an Algebra 1 EOC, put that in their junior high calculation the year that they take it, when they're an 8th grader. It should go to the junior high, okay? But then also the next year, even though they took the test the prior year, give it to the high school that they're attending also. Now, this is just for Domain 1. Their SAT, ACT performance level is not going to go away because it still fits into Domain 3. So they can't get around the ESSA requirements there, so a score does have to go in for Domain 3. So anyhow, including that, basically that score 2 years in a row is a proposal. For graduation, that is the graduation component of Domain 1. Still going to use the best of the 4, 5, or 6 graduation rate or dropout rate if a graduation rate's not available. But they are proposing an incentive for early graduates, so encouraging schools to allow students to graduate early. And so early graduates, right now it's 4, 5, or 6 cohort. And so if you graduate early, you don't get credit for that until your cohort goes through. So what they're proposing is allow those early graduates, even though they're not in the cohort, to count the year they graduate and then count with their cohort. So that's a proposal. All right, for CCMR, that's the other portion of Domain 1 for high schools, and that is college, career, and military readiness. Some pretty big changes here. So TEA is going to use 65% as a baseline for a mid-C moving forward. Currently it's a 44, so that's a 21% increase to scale to a C now. They're planning to set a cut score of 88% for an A, which is a 28% increase to earn an A, to be scaled to that. It's these new aggressive increases to the scaling are supposed to align to post-secondary goals and for not only college enrollment but persistence. So prior it's been college enrollment, and now it's things that could possibly happen beyond the high school that you attend. So do you enroll in college and then do you persist through college? So that's interesting. But the areas that students can earn CCMR points, those haven't changed. So still SAT, ACT, AP, IB, industry-based certifications, et cetera. So that the areas haven't changed, but 2 areas, the way that you can earn the point have changed. So industry-based certification, they're doing a phase-in of attaching industry-based certification to a program of study. So if a student earned an industry-based certification, they used to earn a CCMR point. Just they pass the cert, they're good. But now they won't get points for just passing and earning an industry-based certification. They will only get a point if they earn the industry-based certification and they complete the program of study aligned to that certification. So that will have an impact on the students that historically had received a point in that category. And then also, we've had military, it's college, career, and military readiness. We've had it, but we've never been able to get the data for that. Initially, when this first started in 2018 and 2019, it was intent to enlist in the military, which was not reliable. And so then TEA just said, hey, no military for a minute. We're not going to do that until we can get some reliable data. So what they are now offering is that if a student enlists, if they bring their, I believe it's a DDS form, if they bring that and turn that into their high school campus that they attend, then they will be able to receive a point for military, and they'll get their CCMR point. So, but we have to have the form, and that comes from the student. So at least it's an option now moving forward. So. All right, I'm going to move into Domain 2. And as you know, Domain 2 has 2 parts. So there's Part A and there's Part B. Part A methodology has pretty drastically changed. So I'll get to that here in a moment. And it's shifting to a transition table model. as opposed to the prior model of growth for annual from one year to the next. So U.S. Department of Ed rejected the replacement of the student achievement component in Domain 3. Why am I talking about Domain 3? Well, because TEA wanted to put accelerated learning into Domain 3 as a component, and that was rejected. It is now being moved into Domain 2A. So it's not going to just be annual growth that students experience. That's only one portion now of 2A. The other portion is accelerated instruction for students that are prior year failures. So I'll move into that now. So for STAR and EOC, you have two tables here, Domain 2A, two tables. Used to be a 4x4 matrix because we have 4 performance levels. Did not meet, approaches, meets, masters. So what did you do the prior year? What have you done the current year? And that kind of places you in your appropriate row and column. Then, historically, past 5 years, then a difference was calculated between your prior year score and your current score. And if that was expected or accelerated, you would receive a full point in most of the places on the chart. Well, now there's not just the 4 traditional performance levels. As you can see on the chart, it now has a low did not meets and a high did not meets, and a low approaches and a high approaches. So basically it's 6 performance levels, and so we have now 6 categories from prior year, and then the same 6 categories for the current year. This is all categorical for this year. They're not going to calculate any differences in scale scores, okay? So what that would mean is if I'm a low approaches grade level last year, so that would put me on that third row, and I stay low approaches grade level this year, well then that places me in the third column. So third row, third column, I'm eligible for a half point of growth, okay? If I was meets grade level last year and I stay meets grade level this year or master's grade level this year, I get a full point. If I was meets and I become approaches this year, I don't get any points. There is no half option for every single performance level. Okay, so that's not wildly different from what it was before, 4 performance levels to now 6. The main difference is taking away the calculation. Okay, but that's going to be the first section of 2A. This second section is completely new. And let me say, for growth, any student in 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, for example, for an elementary, or 7th and 8th grade for a junior high, any of the students in the grades other than 3rd, because they didn't take a STAR in 2nd, have the opportunity to be included in academic growth, as long as you have a prior year score. But the second portion of accelerated learning is a subset, and it's only students that failed the STAR the prior year. That's the denominator. And the only way to get a point is to pass the STAR this year. So you'll see there is no 0, half, 1 on that second table. It's just 0 if you didn't meet, or 1 if you approach, meet, or master. Okay, so if I'm a master's level student, I will get my points or be eligible to get points in the first component because I was master's, and if I stay master's, I'll get a point. But I cannot go into the second section because I was a master's level child, okay? So I'm only going into this calculation one time. But if I failed the test last year, then I have my opportunities on the first table to earn a growth point. And then I have another opportunity to get points in the second section. So I'm going into the calculation twice. But the only students that can go into the calculation twice are students that failed the test the prior year. So if I grow, that's great, and I get 2 points to contribute to academic growth. But if I do not, then 2 zeros are going into academic growth. Okay. So this is the same concept for STAR Alt 2 and EOC Alt 2 students. They have different levels. That test has different performance levels, and we have a very small population of students that take that, but the growth charts are included there. Now for the scaling. So for the 2A scaling, I have, again, 2 sections. I have annual growth, and then I have the accelerated learning. So the sum of the points earned for annual growth students, so any student that has a prior year score, regardless of the performance, divided by the sum of the maximum, gives me a raw. And then for accelerated learners, the sum of the points earned by the students that failed the prior year over the sum of the maximum points available. So these are going to be combined to create one raw score and then converted to a scaled score. I think one of the good things about this is that, well, just about the categorical, not the double section, is that the prior system, if you were an English tester, you could only get growth if you stayed English. Spanish testers could not get growth points when they eventually tested in English because the scales were different. So there was no way to determine the growth from the different language versions. Also, 8th grade math to, 8th grade reading to English 1, those students were not eligible for growth. But now since it's all categorical and the scale scores are not being pulled into this, those students are able to now earn growth points. So that is a good piece to this. So I'm now going to move into part B, the second part of domain 2, and that's school progress, the relative performance portion. And there's no changes proposed for domain 2B, except for cut points are just going to be adjusted to account for the 2022 ECO-DIS percentages and then the updated baseline STAR and CCMR outcomes. Okay, now domain 3, this one's always intense. So domain 3, closing the gaps. Big change for this is that, well, there's a lot of big changes actually all over the place for domain 3, so bear with me, please. So student group targets are going to be by school type now. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide and just kind of show you what the school targets are right now. But this is regardless of level, these are the targets for the various components and subgroups, student groups. So I'm going to go back now, and so we're going to have that chart for each level. So the targets will be created for all of those components for elementary, for middle or junior high, and then high school. So before, your all student group, for example, for academic achievement reading was 44%. Well, that was regardless of level. Now it's supposed to be fine-tuned based on the STAR outcomes pre and post-COVID, so that maybe elementary is 40, junior high is 46, high school is 42, something like that. So it's not going to be consistent across the levels. And those targets are going to be published on January 1st, 2023. And so we'll go ahead and update all our databases because it's going to take a long time with all those targets. But the baseline rates will be established for each student group based on disaggregated statewide averages. So for STAR, for the student achievement and growth and the school quality, that's going to be pre and post-COVID averages. For the first 5 years, it's based on those, and then in 5-year increments to move towards those 2032 long-term targets. But we'll deal with that on the next refresh. So anyhow, then the graduation is based on the 22 graduates, and CCMR is based on 21 graduates. So before, in domain 3, student groups either met the target on the color sheet here, or they didn't meet the target. So they either no points or 1 point. Even if I exceed that target, that 44%, I could have 70%. It doesn't matter. I met 44, I got a point. Okay. Or I didn't meet 44, I didn't get a point. 0 or 1. But now they're going to award graded outcomes for performance and then growth toward targets. So it's 0 to 4, and you will receive 0 points per subgroup if you don't meet the interim target, the one that's based on that pre and post COVID average, and then you don't show minimal growth. You get 1 point if you don't meet the interim target, but you show minimal growth. Minimal growth is 1%, with the exception of graduation. It's 0.1% for graduation. You get 2 points if you don't meet the interim target, but you show expected growth towards the interim target. Well, that formula is your current year rate minus your prior year rate. If that's larger than the interim target minus the prior year rate divided by 5 the first year, 4 the second year, 3 the third year, and so on and so forth, then you get 2 points. If you meet the interim target, which that's what's going to be on this, then you get 3 points. And then if you meet the long-term target that you're supposed to reach by 2032, then you get the full 4 points. And this is by subgroup, by level. Okay. Now, Domain 3 has all the student groups that we've been discussing. And before it was 14 groups. Let me go back to that color sheet so you can see how there are 14 different values for each component. There's now going to be 5 student groups. However, the racial groups will still receive their individual targets. So there's 5 student groups: an all student, which we currently have, racial and ethnic groups, and then this consolidation, this super group, is called high focus. It's your economically disadvantaged. EB, pardon my acronym, emergent bilingual, SPED, special education, and then highly mobile, which was previously non-continuously enrolled. So if a student falls in any of those categories, they will go into the high focus group, and they're unduplicated. So if they fall into multiple, they don't go in multiple times, which is different than how it is now. We have special education former as the 4th group. We've had special education formers, so students that have exited out of special education services, and then continuously enrolled. So they're enrolled this year, and then 3 years prior is continuously enrolled. That has stayed the same. So it's much simpler like this. So the minimum group size will be reduced from 25 to 10 students. So in order to be eligible to be counted, in prior years, you had to have at least 25 students in the group. You now only have to have 10. It's trying to include more groups and students in the component calculations is TEA's aim. Okay. Now the methodology will not change, so no changes there. But the groups have changed and the graded outcomes have changed. So for academic achievement, I have 4 eligible groups for the academic achievement component. So you see that there's a 0 to 4 under the all students for reading and math. Then you have 0 to 4, 2 0 to 4s in that racial ethnic group, that pink section. Your 2 lowest performing from the prior year will be used. Then you have a high focus group, that's that consolidation. So what will be determined is, did your groups meet the target, or what 0 to 4 outcome did they receive? So the all student, if let's just say I have 1 in the all student, which is, go back to your outcomes, I didn't meet the interim target, but I showed minimal growth. Okay, so I have 1 for my all student group and 1 from each of my 2 lowest performing racial groups from the prior year, and then 1 for my high focus group. So my sum would be 4, because I have 4 groups that are possible for that component. So that's what I earned. I would divide that by the points that were possible for that group. Well, there was 4 points for all students, 4 points for each of the racial groups, and then 4 points for the high focus. So it would be 4 divided by 16 possible points. And then I would weight that, whatever that value is, and that would give me my component raw score. That's gonna happen for each of the components. And the weights are there on the table. You can see that. I won't go through that. That hasn't changed. Then I sum those raw scores and scale that. And then that is my domain 3. Okay. So there is a proposed change, though, to domain 3 to make it like domain 2, so that it has 2 parts. So that was A. They're proposing a part B. This is new. This would be bringing in the results-driven accountability. Results-driven accountability, it's not new. It's just not included with A to F. And so this is a means to bring that in. And then TEA has discussed reducing any redundancies because it focuses on similar groups, the special education, bilinguals, so groups that are already in A to F, so they will work on how they're going to incorporate that. And for the first 5 years, since they're still not sure how to incorporate it without being redundant, it's just going to be report only. And it will only be for the district level, not for the campus level. So we've made it past all the domains, and now we're moving into the rating. So the district rating, we've discussed this. This is, I think, maybe one of the first things that they talked about was this proportionality method. So the weighted proportionality steps are shown. Determine number of students that are in grades 3 through 12 at each campus, sum that value, divide that by the total number of students enrolled in the district that are in 3 through 12. That gives you the weight for that campus. Then you multiply the campus domain scaled score by the weight to determine the points that that campus is going to contribute to the district rating, and then sum those points for the district total domain score. But this picture shows those steps a little bit, but it was a little bit more fun. So in this example, we have 5 campuses in this district. And then, so that first column shows the campuses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then it shows their 3 through 12 enrollment by campus. Okay, shows the scores. Now the weights are derived, so if I add 334, 990, 62, 761, and 270, I believe I get 2,417. So then I take the 334 and I divide by that sum. That's what gives me the 13.8. And I take the 990 and divide by that same sum for the district. That gives me the 41%. So those are the weights. So then I take the score that those campuses received in whatever domain it is, because they're going to do this by domain. And then that gives me the district domain rating. So campus 1 and 2, they both scored an 85, right? But since campus 2 is bigger, their weight is larger, and they're going to contribute more to the district's domain rating. Okay. Rating methodology, we started with this slide. For districts and campuses, that's going to remain the same. So 70% will go to the better of your student achievement or school progress, domains 1, 2A, or 2B. And then the remaining 30% will be from closing the gaps. Now, on that first 70% portion, if either of the 1 or the 2, A or B, if either of those scaled scores is less than a 60, then the highest scaled score that you can get from either of those is an 89. Okay. Rating adjustments. So once the score has been mathematically calculated, some of them are reduced. And so this is an example of rating adjustments that were not in the proposed model when they were moving from the index system to this domain system for the 2018 school year. So these rating adjustments came about, I think, the week before the final system was published in August. So, like I said, this is all proposed, and there will most likely be changes, things slipped in along the way. So, okay. if you do your calculation, if you have an F rating in 3 of your 4 domains, so 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. So if you have 3 Fs in any of those 4 domains, then the highest scaled score that you can get is a 59, unless your domain 1 scaled score is greater than or equal to 60. So we have had campuses that get, we run projections, or this, when we apply this rule, sometimes it'll knock a campus down that mathematically got to a passing grade, but then they get dropped down. So if a D rating is received in 3 of the 4 areas, so domain 1, 2A, 2B, or 3, then the highest that district or campus can get is a 69, unless the domain 1 scaled score is greater than or equal to 70. Okay. And then a district cannot receive an overall or a domain rating of an A if any of the campuses have a scaled score less than a 70 that are going to feed into that district rating. So the highest scaled score that the district could receive would be an 89. So they're just going to cap them, just drop them back down, even if the math works out a different way. Okay. Distinction designations and badges, they're still working on this. We have received very little information on this. So that's going to be published in the proposed accountability manual when that comes out in the summer. I'm going to move now to the non-traditional AEA. I'm not going to provide as much detail just because there isn't as much. So for AEAs, those are alternative education agencies. And so that's our DRS schools, so our dropout recovery schools. So their domain 1 is also student achievement, and it is STAR, CCMR, and completion, not graduation, but it's the same concept. So for their domain 1, for the STAR portion of that, students will get 1 point for approaches, 2 points for meets, 3 points for masters. That is the denominator, or excuse me, the numerator sum, and then that is divided by the number of STAR EOC assessments in all subjects. For completion, like I said, this is basically your graduation, your 4, 5, or 6 year, and that is now going to include previous dropouts who complete in the numerator only. So that's nice. So they're going to take the longitudinal graduates plus any previous dropouts who come back and complete, and that's going to go into the numerator. Then the longitudinal graduates minus those previous dropouts who return, that will be your denominator. So that's nice. CCMR, same thing. With if a student comes back and they were a previous dropout and they complete and earn a CCMR, that's rewarded. So the formula is annual graduates plus those previous dropouts who earn a CCMR divided by your annual graduates minus the previous dropouts. Okay, 2A, school progress. So the academic growth portion, that's going to mirror the change that is happening with the traditional that we discussed. 2B, however, is very different for AEA. DRSs have not been evaluated for domain 2B because there's not enough to give them their comparison because it's broken down by that eco-dis and there's just not enough of them. So they're going to create this unique part B, and it's retest growth. So you get 1 point for approaches or better on STAR EOC retest. So this is retest only. And that's divided by the number of students that are taking a retest. So how they're going to scale and how they're going to compare, they haven't really published much on that. Domain 3, closing the gaps. This is going to stay similar to what's happening with the traditional campuses. So that 0 to 4 methodology, the super grouping, rating calculation. I mean, that all mirrors what's happening with the traditional high schools. Now, once the ratings are done and released, then there's this federal school improvement component. So students can get categorized as needing comprehensive support or targeted support, additional targeted support. So the comprehensive support identification methodologies are going to remain focused on that lowest 5% of the domain 3 scaled scores. It used to be domain 3 and overall, it's now just domain 3, and that's by campus type. TEA is going to update graduation rate and drop it down from 67% to 66.7 for those 6 years for the all student group. And then the targeted support and the additional targeted support are going to be updated to focus on campuses with student groups that earn zeros and ones in domain 3. Right now, or excuse me, in 2022, in prior years, it was focused on campuses that had zeros in their student groups, but now it's zeros and ones because we've moved to the graded outcomes. And then no changes to the existing 3-year consecutive methodology that determines which student group goes into that. Here are the student groups that can be looked at for those zeros and ones. So all of your racial groups, then economically disadvantaged, emergent bilingual, both current and monitored, and then the special education, the current special education students. Now, cut points, January 1st, 2023 is what we're being told. So it's supposed to reflect high expectations for student achievement, school progress, and then aiming at reducing the achievement gaps between racial, ethnic groups, and socioeconomic. So the cut points are supposed to remain for a 5-year interval. Here is just a visual of the A to F refresh timeline and process. At the time, it was September to October is when Commissioner was going out and receiving feedback from campus, or excuse me, from districts and regions. We are actually now at the fall 2022, where we have the preliminary A to F system framework that I've just described. So from now on till March of 23, they're going to continue to receive feedback, and then a proposed manual will come out in the spring. The final manual will not be out until August, and then ratings are scheduled for September. So we'll be into the school year with new students and still not know a rating until September. That might impact things, various things. So I won't get into that. I'm just going to move on and ask if there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Trustees, are there questions? Mr. Wilbanks.
Why am I always first? So, thank you, Dr. Lopez. Wow. So, out of all of the states that are under ESSA, does this win the prize for being the most complicated accountability system in the United States?
It wouldn't surprise me.
Well, and I think it's testament to the fact that we have a computer scientist running TEA, which is probably not a good thing, being a data guy myself. It's not who you want designing your system. Wow. So a lot of changes for this, quote, refresh. Have we done, have we done any preliminary modeling based on 21, 22 data in terms of, say, the new accelerated measure and one I was looking at, the domain 2A with the new half-point scales for academic growth? Have we done any modeling to see what the impact would be on our current score with these?
So we had looked at the weighted proportionality for the district rating based on the campuses. That is the only thing. Because this just came out, and so now that we know a little bit more, we're going to go ahead and start updating our accountability coding and programming and start to look at the impact.
A lot of if-then branches. In
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, real quick, Mr. Wilbanks, because you've made some very important points, right? So the irony, and this is going to be more commentary, so I'll warn ahead of time, but the irony is the A through F system was, and even today, even recently speaking with some stakeholders, it was, well, it's so much simpler to understand. And that's why it's A through F. Everybody knows what a B is, everybody knows what a C is, or an A or an F.
No, it's a facade.
And it is.
It's a
Because
facade.
if you ask somebody, well, what does it mean? And you have to explain this, So that's one. I'll move on because I can keep going, I'm not going. But the other point you've made, which is modeling, I think there's two big takeaways, there's many takeaways, but one of them is there's still time to influence this. And I think that is something we should consider, and I think
And
districts are
now-
considering through the legislative session, et cetera. And I'm just gonna point out to 2A, because it's so stark. This
2A.
system was also, for equity purposes, was designed around growth. So said a different way, it was designed to make sure that there was a balance. It's not just about passing, it's about growth, which, again, the whole system was really underpinned with that back 5 years ago, or however many years we've been doing this. It's completely been changed, and growth no longer is something that really provides a balance in the way it's being proposed. There's nowhere else they could put that, you know.
Accelerated.
And so if you put it there, you're watering down, that's a nice way of saying it, growth opportunities. And so it's artificially reducing the growth potential of our students and campuses and all that. And so far, and you've just asked two questions, you may not even asked a question, but it's just things I think we should elevate, because one, what can we do? I think this is still, and in fact, today was even more information from TEA that says there's been so much feedback. They've asked kind of to pause until December so that they can gain their footing and come back and see, you know, let's set it straight for everybody. But this has been consistent, some of it is just like really new, like, hey, let's put the accelerators there, you know. I'm gonna pause because I know you have other questions, so.
Well, I think the thing about the accelerated learning, which they tried to get into domain 3, but the U.S. Department of Education said, no way, that doesn't meet our requirements for how we want to make sure every child succeeds, right? And so they're like, okay, fine, we'll just stick it in 2A. And I mean, I get it. I mean, they want us to be held accountable to get these kids back on track from COVID, right? That I assume is the reason why they want this accelerated measure in
Yeah,
there.
but, and as we've pointed out, there's a domain 1 for a reason, which is if that domain 1 actually says, hey, did you pass, did you not pass?
Right.
And so to now say domain 1 is, part of it is migrating to domain 2, that's gonna
Monies.
affect growth artificially, is disproportionate. And that I think is the frustration and the, like, this is not growth anymore. Just to put it simply, with this kind of system, it really has changed growth. It means something else.
So, I'll be brief. I mean, this is just overwhelming and everyone's all glassy-eyed, and I feel sorry for the students who had to sit through finance updates and STAR. I used to say that you had to be a rocket scientist to understand school finance. No longer, it's this. Accountability is far more complicated. So, you don't think so?
I just think you're setting yourself up.
Yeah, well, all right, well, whatever. So, to me, I'm trying to, you know, run in my head, you know, which one's going to be good for us, what the impact, to me, it seems like the changes on the baseline, increasing the baseline for what a mid-C for a mid-C is, and for an A, those kind of changes to domain 1 are going to have the biggest impact to us, I think. I don't know what, you guys are the experts, I'll let you tell me of what keeps you up most at night with these changes. All of it? Just, but if you had to pick just one.
It'd probably be growth.
Yeah.
Because growth
Yes.
was something that campuses used.
Yeah.
And districts used, and I shouldn't even frame it that way, because we didn't use it. That's what the system was designed to do, is to mitigate things such as learning loss and things with growth, to accurately say, hey, there's been growth. The other thing that we shouldn't lose, because there's so much detail here, but one important point is this whole amassing of campuses to the district rating
Well, that was-
is okay. So conceptually, one could say, okay, well, that kind of makes sense and et cetera. However, and we kind of went through it quickly in that part, but it's the size of the school, not the number of testers in that school. It's the enrollment of
Number
the school
enrollment.
that's going to disproportionately, or proportionally, I should say, affect the district rating. And so that has all kinds of equity implications across the state.
Yeah, if you're
Do you have
largest.
big schools? Do you have small schools? Do you have small high schools, big high schools? And how many of them do you have? Because now it's a proportion. So if you have a whole bunch of big schools or a whole bunch of little schools, it really, I don't know that they fully have realized what that's going to do. Based on test takers, different story perhaps, right? Because you generally have the numbers of kids in those grade levels. But to say the entire enrollment, so if you have pre-K all the way to 6th, and other districts have, 4th and 5th, you start to really design something that has a variable that really is now the variable is causing some of this. And again, that's another big change, but just to point it out, these are some really big changes.
Well, that I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Cavazos, because that was when I was, reading through the TEA's documentation on this, the way they were doing the proportionality for campuses. When I think my guess is a district like us who is economically diverse, but some of our largest high schools are most economically disadvantaged, it's going to disproportionately impact us, say, versus Keller, or even a more homogeneous school district like the Grand Prairie to our east. So that's my guess. I mean, the math will bear it out, and that's why I'm curious about your models. But yeah, no, I'm worried.
Yeah, and grade configuration that has existed for years and years and years in different school districts are now going to be a variable because of how you're designed. And again, this proportionality is not new. It's something that they've been wanting to do, but it's always been foundationally with the test takers of the campus, the number of test takers versus enrollment that now you capture, hey, do you enroll pre-K, do you not, do you have, but go ahead.
It is 3 through 12.
3 through 12,
Yeah.
okay. But, so it's, okay, but the enrollment of the school, no?
Right, 3 through 12 enrollment.
Enrollment of the school, okay, that helps, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. So it is imperative, and now's the time for us to be having those conversations, not just us as trustees, but our whole community, to be loud and clear with our local delegation and anyone down in Austin who will listen, that we need simplification of STAR, if not, it's outright elimination as something, but we need a better system, not a more complex system. This is bananas.
And the STAR is being redesigned. The cut points are being,
Oh yeah, that's the other thing, yes, that was last time.
so yeah, and
Yeah.
any modeling we do first, we have to wait for the cut points.
Yeah.
Because
it's
they're not gonna scale the same way that they're scaling right now. So even if we
Exactly.
took our 22 scores and applied this, these changes, how meaningful is it if all the cut points become different, which they're going to, and then the STAR redesign, a 1360 is not approaches level for grade level or grade 3 math anymore. Who knows what it will be? We don't know. There's a lot of unknown. So,
Yeah.
but we will do our best.
Yeah, we love uncertainty, don't we? No, thank you. I can't imagine what it's like to be you during these times and having this dumped on your laps. It's just insane. I don't know the appropriate Eagles song to quote at this moment. Maybe my colleague, Mr. Chapa, can help me out.
Maybe not an Eagles song. Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. I do have Dr. Reich's light lit up. Dr. Reich.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. I just want to say thank you very much for the detailed information, the work that you do. I guess you can thank the state for never-ending job security. This ultimately, yes, we do need to take action. I guess my request would be of the administration, of you, is to perhaps provide a condensed, like, one-page or talking points about the ramifications of this, because I can come up with 3 or 4, maybe 5 listening, but I want us to be able to, as you said, Mr. Wilbanks, to advocate to our community so that they understand this isn't easy to understand. So I would request that for our community, for our legislators, et cetera. I think that could go a long way to really drive home the points of the proportionality, the inequities, the missing the whole point of no child left behind, because this is ultimately going to make more behind, because districts are going to be unfairly characterized as a poor performing district, potentially. I mean, there's no other way around it. So again, thank you for this work. I look forward to, kind of look forward to the updates. No, I really do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. Any further comments or questions from trustees? Dr. Cavazos?
Yeah, real quick, Dr. Reich, and you reminded me, so thank you for the reminder, that we have visited with principals and others, and really the message today, even though this is what it is to remain focused on effective classroom instruction, regardless of system, and we'll battle that, right? But the focus in the classroom is on the students and their instruction, because these are the students that are going to take the test in the spring, the ones we have this year. So this is not like some far off years from now. They're about to take the test in next semester. And so it's an important message. It's important to understand the changes for our staff. It's important to project at some point, but it's really important to remain focused on the best effective instruction we can have in the classroom. And so that's what I've reminded principals as well recently on that. So I just thought I'd add that in. Thank you.
Mr. Hibbs, Ms. Mays, would you like to pile on? Ms. Mays.
Since you asked, that is research and accountability. And if that mic wasn't attached, I would have told you to drop it when you finished.
Mr. Hibbs is out. Most of my thoughts have been said by others up here. We've said this, I think, every time we get an annual update on STAR, every time the legislature meets, every time TA does something different, that we switched to this A through F system, and it was sold to the public as we're simplifying how people can identify, good schools, bad schools, underperforming, overperforming schools. And, for the students in here, first of all, thanks for making it this far with us, but this is all about the STAR test. So when you take the STAR test, it's not just did you pass, did you fail, and then everybody's graded on that. It goes through this complicated morass of a system that, looks at a lot of other factors too, and that's how your school gets graded. So if you're at a school that has a B, your STAR test might just be one component of that. And I was especially disappointed to see the change in how they've done CCMR. Because when CCMR first came out, it was a boon, I think, for districts like us who were forward-thinking in how we looked at opportunities for students, not just at college, but beyond college. And that was a big part of our 14 bond, for example, was the Career Tech Center. And so we were at the forefront of getting ahead of that, lining up programs so our students could get those industry certifications. And they have, since from the beginning, I think, continued to make it harder for us to show that we're serving our students well, even though we are doing a lot, even though we're doing it very well. The goalposts keep moving in a way, and we've done very well, but eventually this goalpost moving is going to make districts like us, who are doing a very solid job in career preparation programs, look like we are not, even though we have leading edge career and technical programs. And I was also a little disturbed by the concept that we might be graded on persistence several years after the students leave us. I mean, it's one thing to look at a 5 or a 6 year graduation rate when we still hypothetically have some, control over that. But especially in a district that has the challenges that we do, the high economically disadvantaged proportion of our students, students who come from our district on average are not similarly situated to someone, say, coming from a Highland Park or a South Lake, who have an abundance, on average, an abundance of resources relative to our students to do things like persist through a 4-year program straight through, whereas some of our students, because life happens, they may have some things that interrupt that college progression. They may have to help their families, and it was something, tons of research backs this up, that those life opportunities are not the same. And the idea that a district like us would be hurt by the fact that one of our students might go out, might start a program, life might intervene, but then they pick up a few years later and ultimately complete it, but we're dinged for that intervening life change, I think really frustrates the equity goals that purportedly are put into this system. And there are several other things that my colleagues brought up that I think are going to make it very hard for districts like us. And I do, at some level, and I've said this before, we keep finding a way in this state to design accountability systems that disproportionately ding districts that have challenges that a lot of districts don't. And we could get into whether or not that this is just part of the big plan to make public ed look bad, because we now apparently have vouchers coming up in the next legislative session. And if we make the publics look bad enough, then wow, people are going to, think that they got to go somewhere else to get a better deal. So things like this make it hard not to think like that. But I will stop extemporaneously speaking, and unless there are further questions, Dr. Lopez, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, that was our last discussion item for the evening. We are now moving on to our open forum for non-agenda items. This second open forum segment of the meeting provides citizens with an opportunity to address the trustees on any subject except personnel. This is not intended to be a discussion or a debate. The trustees will not reply to speakers. Derogatory comments aimed at an individual will not be tolerated. You will have 2 minutes to speak, and Mrs. Benjamin will notify you when your time is up. If you have any documents for the board to review, please hand them to the Assistant Superintendent of Administration, Dr. Michael Hill, who's at the back of the room. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board on non-agenda items?
Yes, sir, we have 2 requesters.
Thank you. Ms. Benjamin, who is our first requester?
Mr. Stephen Poole.
All right, Mr. Poole. The instruction about derogatory comments was specifically aimed at you, Mr. Poole.
Just call me out by name next time. Good evening, members of the board, Mr. Chopin, Dr. Cavazos. I'm bringing good news tonight. A couple of weeks ago, we published our annual comparison of teacher salaries, and I want to share the results for Arlington with you tonight. At year 0, you rank 5th out of 32 school districts. There's always an arms race for that beginning teacher salary, and that's understandable. We want to attract people into the profession, but we all know that's not the be-all and end-all. It's the veteran employees that actually make our district run, and you did really well this year in the comparison. At year 5, you're ranked 2nd out of 32 districts. At year 10, 15, 20, and 25, you're 1st in North Texas. And at year 30, you're ranked 6 out of 32. Think back 4 years ago, pre-TRE. If you remember this chart, there was a big dip in the middle. Because the voters supported the notion of pay our teachers, the campaign for the tax ratification election, and because of your hard work and the hard work of the superintendent, the CFO, and his team, got us to where we are right now. And I want to recognize that hard work. This does not happen overnight. But just like a garden, it takes tending. And this is something every year we're going to have to tend. It may be easier when you have $300 million in your fund balance. But we can't look up 4 years from now and be back to where we were 4 years ago. So I'll be working with you and the superintendent and his team on this year after year. But I also want to take a little bit of my time to say thank you to Mr. Kell and his team looking at the insurance issues, because we know it's not just compensation but benefits. But there's work to do there, and there's work to do in the legislative session, and I'll work with you on that as well. But they did a fantastic job, deep dive, and I have nothing but utmost confidence in their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have another requester?
Yes, sir. Mr. David Jarvis.
Mr. Jarvis, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is David Jarvis. On October 3rd, I emailed all members of the Board of Trustees and asked you to consider 4 simple questions. What policy guidance are your teachers given about how they should respond to a student asking questions related to sexual orientation, gender identity, use of restrooms, locker rooms by transgender students? And also, what is your policy about whether teachers are required to notify students' parents about such conversations? This board has refused to answer any of these questions. Texas law, in my opinion, states that, Texas law states that parents are partners with boards of trustees in their children's education, and a board of trustees may not limit parental rights. Texas law also states that a parent has a right to direct the moral training of their child, and that a school district may not violate the fundamental right and duty of a parent to direct the upbringing of the parent's child. In my view, by refusing to answer these 4 questions, you have made a decision to conceal from parents information about their children that every parent has a right to know. In my view, concealing this information from parents is a clear violation of Texas law. How can you possibly consider parents as your partners when you conceal your policies from them and thus unlawfully violate their parental rights? All board members serve as elected officials in a vital position of public trust. However, when you conceal this vital information from parents, you have betrayed the public trust you claim you are guarding. Why are you concealing this information from parents? If you believe your current policies are correct and sound, why don't you have the courage of your convictions and answer these questions? The troubling message you are sending is twofold. Parents do not have a right to answers to these very important questions, and this board thinks you have no legal or moral obligation to be transparent and honest with parents by simply answering this question.
Thank you, sir. Your time is over.
That concludes our open forum for non-agenda items. Moving on to our superintendent's report, Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa, and tonight share some information about our school district. You may have heard this before, but I'd like to thank our latest winner of the Dallas Cowboy Reliant Class Act Teacher of the Month. Remember, we had a September winner, Alice Monroe, and now we have an October winner in Bowie High School teacher coach, Sammy Epps. If that wasn't enough, we also had a November winner from Miller Elementary, Carly Glass. In the 3 years this award has been given, we've now had 7 winners in Arlington ISD. They received $4,000 in a grant from Reliant, and the winners were selected out of more than 80 submissions. So that speaks of our outstanding work in Arlington ISD, of our teachers, and you see their smiling faces. Coach Epps got also a jersey, just didn't get the picture with it. While we're on outstanding employees, I'd like to congratulate our October Employees of the Month. Our high school teacher of the month was Bowie English teacher Amanda Molina. Also, our junior high teacher was Emily Stubbs at Young Junior High. Cafeteria at Spear Elementary got into the celebration when we honored Margarita Ramirez for her work at the Food and Nutrition Services, for being our employee or department employee of the month. And then a surprise for Blanton's second grade teacher, Ariana Gutierrez, for her work as the teacher of the month for elementary. Again, congratulations. This is an outstanding opportunity for us to recognize teachers, and I'll be out tomorrow honoring our November Teachers of the Month. Recently, we celebrated a big day at Gunn Junior High Fine Arts and Dual Language Academy. So you see that we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the school. and a lot has changed since Gunn opened in 1972. And it was all on display. It featured theater, dance, choir, as well as a tour of the school. And so I want to thank all our taxpayers that voted for the bond. So this made this school possible, this renovation, and you see some happy faces there. We were honored and fortunate to have 2 American heroes visit our campuses recently. Medal of Honor recipient Major General Patrick Brady visited students at Sam Houston High School. And Don Graves, one of the few remaining men who fought in Iwo Jima in World War II, visited students at Martin High School. I was fortunate to follow General Brady around at some of the Sam Houston High School classrooms. He's there. He was very happy to meet Joe Looney, by the way, who used to play with the Dallas Cowboys. He's standing there with Major General. And it was a great honor to have these individuals visit our schools. I appreciate their service and their commitment to helping our students continue a legacy of excellence. Speaking of heroes, I'd like to congratulate our students in the 18+ program, and there's Dr. Rice was able to join them, thank you, for their own work as heroes. When a gentleman that you know, Dwayne Lee, lost his wedding ring of nearly 50 years at the Water Chase Golf Club, it seemed like the ring would be lost forever. But that wasn't the case when our students went to work there as part of our 18+ program. They found out about the missing ring, and they looked everywhere in that course. And they found the ring in the parking lot. I want to thank their teacher, Krista Zometa, and of course, Dwayne Lee sponsored a party in their honor, and he was so happy to have the ring. His wife was happy that the ring was found too. So I want to thank them and thank you to our teacher and everyone involved in the 18+ program for their work and their dedication. And finally, today I got to serve some green beans. Lots and lots of green beans. I was able to get a feel of just how much our elementary students really like green beans or don't like green beans, despite as much effort as I did to try to sell them. Thanksgiving celebration was at our elementary schools, and I want to thank Lynn Hale Elementary for allowing us to come over and serve all the turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and of course, if you didn't want turkey, you could have chicken, which was also popular. The day ran smoothly. I want to thank David Lewis because there were 42,000 Thanksgiving meals served. And David, thank you for your work, and thank you to all our food service staff for making this possible. A lot of turkey and some green beans, not as much as the turkey, but it was excellent, and I appreciate it, David. Thank you for your work and all your staff. Well, we didn't move that fast, but Spence has magic. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Dr. Cavazos. We'll move on to school board reports. Are there trustees with reports? There will be a report, and it will come from Mr. Wilbanks.
Yeah, apparently so.
Thank you, Vice President Chapa. So Ms. Mays and Ms. McMurrow and I had the opportunity to be hosted at Irving ISD at their Academy High School on MacArthur for the North Texas Area Association of School Boards. And we had experts from Raise Your Hand Texas, TASB, and one other advocate group about how to advocate with our local delegation and be effective. And it was very informative, and there were a lot of great pointers guided, and it was pretty prescient because of our topic tonight on how we need to advocate for change on things like our school accountability system.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Any other trustees with reports? I will just briefly report that I had the opportunity a couple weeks ago to go to the UIL One Act Play Junior High edition, which we formerly did not have that at the junior high level, and was very impressed with the plays that I saw. Saw 5. There's different regions, and at the junior high level, it was amazing that some of those junior highs, or I did One Act Play in high school, and some of those junior highs would compete, I think, at the high school level with some of the performances they put on. And at the same time, within a couple of weeks, we've also had a special performance at the CVPA for our dance program, Jeté, which was last weekend. And then we also had a celebration of the 50th anniversary of AISD's orchestra program, which serves several thousand students. And I think it's something growing up in AISD you take, kind of take for granted that there's such a strong fine arts program. But for those who don't know, this district is nationally recognized in the fine arts and has been for a long time. And we have quite a few fine arts programs that are not offered widely, and especially to the scale that we do. And so I wanted to give a shout out to the fine arts folks in the district. Saw some really incredible things over the last few weeks, and it's a testament to the investment that they've made in our kids. And with that, that's my report. Seeing no other reports, we'll move on to secretarial matters. Mr. Designated Secretary, do we have any items to consider?
We have one item to consider. So Dr. Reich has requested that we get a talking points that we can share with the community on all of the unintended consequences on the proposed accountability system changes.
Okay, thank you for that report, Mr. Designated Secretary. At this time, it is 9:26 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.